Wow. So I just finished watching Terminator Zero, started and finished it. Very short series, 8 episodes, 25 minutes each. And I really enjoyed it. So I wanted to talk about it. So I did not have super high expectations going in, to be completely honest, because, the Terminator series has not exactly been great for a long time. Pretty much every movie that's come out since 2 has been kind of okay at best, give or take. Um, so I was really surprised at how good this was. I hoped that it would be fresh and original and take advantage of the medium of anime. I was just concerned that between being Netflix and Terminator, that it would not do those things. But I actually think that it did. I think it did a good job of taking advantage of this medium to tell a fresh and original story for the series that is self-aware of the failures of the series and attempts to explain the series and turn the reality of the series into like canonized lore. So this will be full spoilers, and I want to jump into it. But one of the first things that I think is important about the show is that it kind of reestablishes the canon of the series. They talk a lot about the various characters criticize a lot the failures of this future war, this endless future war that's been happening between Skynet and people that we've been witnessing in all the past movies, where they send someone back, or the Terminator gets sent back, and then a hero gets sent back, and then you do this over and over again, and nothing comes of it. And the people in the story, multiple people criticize the story or criticize that element of this narrative as everyone's been stupid and short-sighted. Skynet hasn't realized the problem here. Humanity hasn't realized the problem here. And so what the protagonist of this story is trying to do is to find a new way forward, because clearly this is not working. And they also explain how time travel works, which I don't think they ever really have in the series. And basically, they've decided that you cannot go back and change your future. It is not a single timeline that gets altered. It is many timelines. And every time you go back in the past and you create a divergence, you create a new timeline. So they've explained basically that every movie and series in the Terminator franchise has mattered and has been canon. It all happened, and none of it's contradictory, because basically every movie is its own timeline. Terminator 1, 2, 3, Salvation, Genesis, Dark Fate, they're all canon, they all happened, and none of them really contradict each other because they're all just different timelines. People hated in Dark Fate that John Connor died instead of getting to go on and do whatever after the events of Terminator 2. And people didn't understand how Terminator 3 even happened if Terminator 2 happened. Well, this movie basically says it doesn't really matter. You can go back and you can change one past and you can prevent Skynet from being created in one timeline, but that's just one timeline. Skynet already exists in the future. It's already kind of a universal constant. It will always exist. And so there are basically infinite timelines where Skynet could send someone back to and try to change the future. And I think that that's a really good way to explain this, because they were certainly never going to explain it the other way, where somehow all of this did make sense in a single shared timeline, while acknowledging that this history that they have has not been working out super good. And it reminded me a little bit of how Deadpool treated the MCU in the newest Deadpool movie, where they acknowledge things have not been in a good state. And my hope with both Terminator and Marvel is that acknowledgement will come alongside of a plan to do something new and different. And it seems like that's what we're going to get, because this show does set up for a season 2 or for something else to happen after this series that will follow in this story. And it also means that because they've basically canonized the idea that the entire franchise is just a series of anthology films with no exact connection to each other, anything could happen now. We are no longer bound to John Connor and Skynet. So anything could happen now. Nothing contradicts. It's all just these stories about man versus machine. And in that vein, this series itself isn't just an action set piece, which is kind of what, a lot of the movies turned into. Is it Dark Fate and Genesis? They were enjoyable to watch, but I don't know that they really had anything to say. I mean, Dark Fate literally just said, "Yeah, it doesn't matter. You stop Skynet, but like, there's another evil computer system, so who cares?" It had an interesting idea about how the Terminator turned old and kind of developed humanity. That was interesting. They didn't explore it as much as they could have. But this series very much is interested in exploring ideas of sentience, free will, what makes a person or a machine. And I think it does that really well. And I think anime was a good medium to do this because obviously that's some well-treaded path in this genre, in this medium. It is kind of Ghost in the Shell like. I've seen briefly some reviews that compared it to Ghost in the Shell. I think that's a little unfair to say it's a kind of a cheap imitation of Ghost in the Shell because it's not exactly what's happening here. But it's exploring similar themes of, well, what is a person? What is sentience? And I think it does that well because there are several moments to sort of get into what happens in the story. Um, Basically, Malcolm Lee has created his own, hopefully benevolent free will artificial life form in the form of Kokoro. And Kokoro challenges Malcolm. I could save you, but why would I? Why would I reach a different conclusion than Skynet? What has humanity done? How can you prove to me that you're worth saving? And they point out that humanity is basically a warmongering species that has really done nothing but destroy the planet, everyone around it, and itself at every possible opportunity. And when you look at that, those facts, it's a good question. What outside of our own need to be self-preserving and to assert our superiority over other species on the planet, why would something save us from basically ourselves? And Kokoro points out Skynet is our creation. It's just another extension of guns and nuclear weapons and these things that we make to destroy ourselves. Skynet is the ultimate example of humanity's hubris, basically. It's just the next weapon designed to self-destruct the species. So why would Kokoro, even if they could, why would she step in and stop that? And so the series is about trying to answer that question. And so for most of the series, what Malcolm is trying to do is he's trying to develop a trust in Kokoro. That's what he's been doing this whole time. Is he built the system and he's testing it. He wants to make sure that if he puts it online and he gives it ultimate power, it's not going to just become another Skynet. And so he does that, and then he eventually really has not much choice. He doesn't necessarily have full faith and confidence, but he doesn't have a choice. The apocalypse is happening right now, so it's he takes his best bet on this. Kokoro does save them, and it stops the destruction in Tokyo specifically, as far as we can tell, or in Japan greater. But they're not fully benevolent. They still want to be proven, why should I help you? I'm giving you the more time that you asked for. And so with that time, he needs to demonstrate why Kokoro should preserve humanity. And I think the idea is that Kokoro may have access to all of the information about people, so it may have a full log of human history. But if you just look at the facts of human history, you're really only seeing the cruelties and the wars and the atrocities. People don't typically document, not as often, the sort of the good of humanity. It doesn't go as documented as often. Just as an example, I happened to be listening to a podcast today about a serial killer. And it wasn't actually really supposed to be a podcast about the serial killer. It's supposedly a podcast about the killings, and it's giving focus to the people and their stories who were victims of the murder. who in this case happened to be a serial killer. But what they said, and I thought was interesting at the time in the episode, was that the victim's name had been forgotten largely to history, whereas the killer's name really has been ingrained in human history. Everyone knows the killer. I'm not mentioning the specifics because I don't think it's super relevant, but the idea is there. And I think that that's relevant. The fact that I happened to come across that today lines up pretty nicely with that idea. So I guess Malcolm's plan then was to demonstrate so that Kokoro could see with her own eyes what about humanity needs to be, protected or preserved. And that's based on what we see, humanity's willingness to self-sacrifice, to pursue either a greater good. It's a little bit mixed because of the actions that Malcolm takes, either a greater good, greater than oneself and one's immediate need, or it's just a more general, like, humans' capacity for love. I'm not entirely sure. It's a little vague, to be honest, because of the events that take place exactly. But either way, Kokoro sees something. They make a determination that they're going to trust Malcolm in the way that Malcolm trusted them. And then that immediately gets turned on its head because now Kokoro has to place her trust and her life in the hands of a human. And so now I want to pivot to talking about the characters. And I guess I'll start with the worst character. Man, I hated this fucking character. So Malcolm has 3 kids. Hiro, Reika, and Kenta. And my God, is Kenta the worst, most insufferable piece of shit in the world. This guy could not lose points any faster. He was speed running point loss. He was digging his own hole so fast. And there was a small moment, a brief moment, where he could have earned points. And technically he did earn a couple points in that moment. But he was already so far down in the hole. And then the next actions that he took were so terrible and in line with everything else that he had done. I could not. I just couldn't. There was no coming back from that after that point. He cemented himself as the worst. This character is a perfect example of having intelligence, but being stupid. And surprisingly, I didn't have much of an opinion on the second child, Hiro, up until this moment. Because what's happening is that it's actually a little bit tough to explain. If you've seen, you know what I'm talking about. It would take a while to explain the setup for this. But Hiro, the things that Hiro does, where he tackles Kenta, and he not only tackles him and kind of prevents something bad from happening in the moment, he beats the shit out of him, or he tries to. I mean, Kenta defends himself. So he doesn't really take any punches to the face. I kind of wish he'd gotten punched in the face a couple times. But he starts beating the shit out of his brother. And not only that, but he calls him out specifically on this thing that I identified episodes ago, which is that Kenta is intelligent, but he is a fucking dumbass. And he gets called out so hard on that. Hiro went from being a nothing character to second best character, like high up on the list in that moment, because Hiro knew what was going on. Like, he understood, and Kenta never did. At no point did he understand anything. I was actually completely convinced that in that moment at the end, when Kokoro had chosen to side with humanity, as far as we can tell, and chose to place her faith in Malcolm, and now had to place her faith and her life in Kenta, I was absolutely convinced that Kenta would make the wrong choice, because he had demonstrated no capacity to make the correct choice at all. And so I was stunned when he made the correct choice. As far as we can tell. I was stunned. It took him a whole series, a whole season to learn anything. And he immediately goes into Shadow the Hedgehog mode, where he's just so deep in his feelings about this. He is so fucked up inside about, I'm not even entirely sure what, to be honest. His entire worldview is shook. And it's baffling because the thing that made him question himself at the end, and the thing that kind of put him on the path of possible destruction, was the word of a Terminator. A Terminator told him, hey, by the way, you could detonate this EMP and destroy Kokoro, and I think you should do it because future you told me that you would. That's the kind of person that you are. And that's an interesting plot twist if that's true. But the idea that suddenly this guy who has hated machines, been so against machines the entire time, would suddenly give any weight to the things being told to him by this machine who has, up until just a few minutes ago, been trying to kill him and his entire family, is absolutely psychotic. This kid is the biggest dumbass. This is the worst character. I actually thought they would kill him in the previous episode. And I thought, like, wow, this is a novel way to get away with killing a kid in a television series, by making him the most insufferable piece of shit that nobody would care when he gets shot in the back of the head. I hated this kid so much. But his other two kids were great. Reika was great. She was in the beginning, very childish, because, you know, a lot of what happens in terms of her getting separated and some of the plot is a result of her chasing her robot cat. Which is, you know, she takes it a bit far, but I can understand there's a sentimental element to that. And so she presents in the beginning as very childish, and you think she's probably not that mature. But actually, she displays a surprising level of maturity at certain points. I mean, she's not, you know, some cold hard killer or anything, certainly not. But despite what's happening around her, and I'm not clear how old these characters are, but despite what's happening around her, she realizes, okay, shit is serious. I need to get serious. I don't know what's happening, but I'm going to place my faith in these people who seem like they're trying to protect me. I'm going to make reasonable, rational decisions. Oh, I forgot to mention, Kenta gets kidnapped because he's so in his feelings about the thing that happened before, about getting his ass beat by his brother. He gets kidnapped and sets up the whole last episode because he's so deep in his feelings. This is exactly the shit Reika does not do. Like, when that Terminator shows up and corners Reika, she immediately pegs this guy that there's something wrong here, and she gets out of that situation. Like, Kenta is uniquely stupid, considering his father and considering his siblings. Kenta is the biggest dumbass, and these other two kids are actually really likable and enjoyable. Malcolm was interesting because I thought initially that Malcolm was just the Malcolm Lee that we're used to, but not exactly. He's from the future. He's been through war. And so his solution is not some wild crackpot theory. It's him seeing in real time that the current effort does not work. Fighting the machines in this way does not work. Sending people into the past to do this back and forth about assassinating people does not work. We need a new solution. And he comes up with a pretty decent one. So far, it seems. We'll have to see how this plays out, because Kokoro is far from, you know, a perfectly benevolent god. But I understand the actions that Kokoro takes. And Kokoro does seem ultimately like she's going to act in both her own interest and in the interest of humanity, even if she's not going to be, you know, nice about it. Which is actually really, I think, is super compelling, that Kokoro will save humanity potentially, but there's going to be some sacrifices along the way. I'm not sure how she decided who needed to die and who didn't. There was an implication that she was only killing people who were armed, but that doesn't line up exactly. There were dead civilians, and we saw a couple of doctors get killed. So I don't know how Kokoro decided who needed to go and who didn't. But I can understand the decision of getting rid of the cops in Japan, because The cops had already demonstrated they were not capable of dealing with this. I mean, obviously they're not prepared to fight a Terminator. And obviously in these kind of movies, the random authorities are never prepared to deal with this situation, right? They're not going to believe the time travel conspiracy bullshit, and they're just going to get in everybody's way. So it makes sense to take them off the board so that they're not a problem for the people who can actually save the fucking world and the species. I got that part. I was less clear about some of the other people that might have been casualties in this. So I don't think Kokoro is perfectly benevolent, but it's actually a good thing that she's not, because that's way more interesting to see how she might go. And the last scene is her, one of her robots bringing her a Terminator skull. And so there's kind of a sinister or ominous implication there, and we'll have to see how that plays out. But I mean, it's not as if having more friendly Terminators would be a bad idea, because Skynet will probably send more to this timeline. Although I'm not sure if they would send more to this timeline. I'm not sure what they'll do with this story from here because of what they have established. They've left it open ended, but I'm not sure where they go from here. Unless what they said about Kenta was true, in which case it's about keeping Kenta from becoming some kind of monster in the future. Although what they said about Kenta was that he brokered a deal between Skynet and humanity, which doesn't make any sense to me as either a character thing that he would do. The kid's just too stupid for that. Or like, why would Skynet agree to that? I we'll have to see how that plays out. I'm not sure. There's some unanswered questions, including like who the prophet is, potentially like Sarah Connor maybe or something. I'm not sure. But overall, I mean, I just really found myself super engaged with this. This is easily the best Terminator content that's come out in a long time. I mean, this is probably the best Terminator content since Terminator 2. And saying that, I kind of want to transition to just more general topics about the state of the Terminator franchise in general. I think that this could be a good revival for the Terminator series, because they could go in a lot of fresh directions from this. If they're willing and able to break away from the nostalgia, to break away from the shackles of always constantly trying to live up to and living in the shadow of Terminator 2, I think the Terminator series could be on an upward trend after this. I think they could go some really interesting places with this, and just concede that this is a anthology series that does have robots in action, but it is also about philosophy. It's going to have something to say, it's going to ask questions, and it's going to be engaging as more than just a pointless popcorn flick that is going to be undone by the next movie. And maybe it will be able to work toward a new type of solution. There could be not a single plot thread necessarily, but there could be a goal in each movie of trying to find a new solution to this problem, this unsolvable problem. What happens next? I think that that's really an exciting direction to take the series. So I'm definitely excited for whatever they do next with this. And I didn't really have any actual legitimate complaints with the series, other than I think some of the CGI looked bad. And I don't know why some of the CGI even had to exist. Like, there were some shots that were CGI, and I didn't really understand why they had to be CGI, because almost nothing was moving even. It was like a still shot, or a mostly still shot, but just at a weird angle. I think Kokoro was always CGI, and I was down with that. That made sense. I think that that's a good idea. But I don't understand why some other shots were CGI. And there was one shot in particular, I think in the last episode of the Terminator, when its human face is melted off, that looked really, really bad. I thought it was a horrible looking shot. It looked terrible. But other than that, I didn't really have any actual complaints. And my problems with Kenta are not necessarily a complaint against the show. I think it's very clear that his characterization is intentional. They are intentionally setting him up this way. Why and what they're planning to do with it, I don't know, but I'm interested to find out. but he is insufferable. Um, but in it not in the worst possible way. I mean, he is. I almost love to hate this kid. He's such a shithead. But we'll have to see where they go with this because he has to have some character development. I think he's going to have to be different if we see him again in another season or whenever else he shows up. And so I'd be interested in finding out about this. I took some notes and I just have, a couple other small comments about the series. But again, these aren't complaints. They're just little observations. So I guess one of the first ones that came up is like, how heavy are Terminators? Like, how are they able to swim? Or how can they get out of water? Because they should be pretty heavy, right? But I think this is another question the movie has never specifically answered is like, how heavy, how strong, how accurate are Terminators? Because you think that they'd be perfectly accurate and they'd never lose a fist fight. But like Terminators are constantly getting kicked around by normal people. They're getting somehow they're walking out of water when presumably they'd be too heavy. And somehow people can survive getting punched or hit by a Terminator. It's just a weird thing. I could probably look up how heavy a Terminator is supposed to be, but I doubt the movies play by any real hard logic with that. They play loose and fast with that. But again, that's not really a complaint. It's just an observation. I thought in the first 2 episodes, it was weird that nipples didn't exist. Like, they do the typical thing of like women's breasts are being covered by long hair. And so the first observation is that there were no short-haired female Terminators. That was interesting. The second observation was that there were a couple shots where Aiko was like you could see her breasts at certain angles or just full on, and there were no nipples. And I just thought the nipple erasure was funny. Like, I don't know why media is so, against the nipple, right? I don't get it. But the show also was not particularly gratuitous. I mean, it was violent, but it wasn't super gratuitous. So I think it was probably going for more of a PG-13 vibe in general. So I'm okay with that. Like, it's fine. It was just a weird observation that they chose to have those shots and angles and basically just exclude the nipples. It was just a little weird. I thought it was interesting that we briefly had kind of a POV or an insight into like the cops in this episode or in this series. And I don't know if we've ever really seen the cops' perspective on these things before. That was an interesting little side quest that we went on, a little digression. Or I don't know if digression is the right word, but it was a nice little thing that we went on. It didn't last long, but I thought that it was a nice diversion to see that perspective and that the cops were kind of reasonable people who actually realized that something was wrong with Misako, but also that very quickly something was going on bigger than them and that they understood. But by the time they got that, it was kind of too late. The Terminator had already shown up and there was really no way out of that situation. Similar to that, the cops kind of deploy all their cars to the wrong people. Like, they send all of the cars after Aiko and Reiko or Reika, and pretty much nothing goes after the Terminator, which was just hilarious. That of course they make the wrong decision on this. So while Aiko is trying to get away, she throws Molotovs at the cops. The cops are dying. They're getting in car accidents and stuff. And Reika makes the observation that you're killing people. And again, I don't know how often the heroes and the good guys have really had casualties on these innocent people, on these random cops and bystanders. I can't really remember exactly those details. I'm sure it has happened, though, where, I mean, even in Dark Fate, I think it opens with that character beating the shit out of a bunch of cops. I don't think any of them die, but she certainly gives them concussions or something. And Aiko just says, like, it doesn't matter. If I fail, we're all going to die. So, like, who cares if I kill these cops? Which I just appreciate that we're being really straightforward about this. The ends justify the means. I'm not going to let these people that don't know what's happening get in my way. And I'm not going to play games with it. I'm here to save the world. Similarly, Aiko, when she showed up, she was a super hard ass. Like, she had no time for anybody's shit. She was pointing guns at everybody, throwing people around, handcuffing people. She had no time for anybody's shit in the beginning, which is understandable, and she does sort of lighten up over the series. But I think all of that lines up that she's just there. She does not care about the individuals. She's here to save the world. And on that note, there was an interesting question that got asked in episode 6 or 7 where the prophet is explaining time travel to her. And she says, Aiko asks, well, if I can't save you and the people that I care about, why would I bother doing this at all? And the prophet says, that's what sets us apart from the machines. The answer to that question is what makes us different than the machines. And I think that that's interesting, because those are sort of conflicting ideas. Is that what she's doing is to preserve a timeline that is not her own and will not save anyone that she knows about, including that person, that sister, whoever that was important to her that may have died in her timeline. But at the same time, you're going to have to sacrifice some people to kind of save the world, right? It's just an interesting observation that they go out of their way to point out. But I appreciated those questions being raised, whereas a lot of times in this kind of media, those casualties don't get mentioned. People don't mention or question, hey, that cop didn't really know what was going on. Did you have to beat him up so bad, or did you have to kill that guy? I appreciate that it was raised and addressed here. I guess one other small complaint that I had is that there's a lot of fucking in this show. And I don't mean sex. I mean, people drop the F word, and specifically the word fucking, a lot. It's almost the only swear word in the show. And it happened at least once an episode that somebody said fucking. And I just found it hilarious how much it kept happening. I don't know if it was meant to be a joke. I don't know if they just were trying to be a little bit of edgy. But it was just an interesting observation that everybody, including Kenta at some point, like everybody said fucking. And I found it fascinating, and it was kind of funny. Something else I appreciated is that when Malcolm builds Misako in his timeline originally, Misako chooses to be a woman, chooses the female voice, and Malcolm asks why. And she's like, men are just fucking terrible. They just destroy everything. Like, I would not like to be a man, was the quote. And I found that very, very relatable. I too would not like to be a man. It's a rough life, okay? I get that, all right? I understood that. I thought it was awesome that the Terminator music was constantly playing in the background. Like, that classic theme was getting kind of reinterpreted all the time in the background. It was just a really nice thing that amplified a lot of the action scenes. To hear that familiar, that familiar music, but remixed slightly, playing at just always the right times. It never felt forced. It was never at the wrong time. It always felt right. And I thought that it was a good implementation of that. I think the last thing I would want to mention is that there was only one thing I was disappointed in that we did not really get, which was a Misako versus Aiko fight. I thought that's what we were going to get. I thought we'd get that. They'd scrap, and then they'd reach, an uneasy alliance, and then they'd, do a tag team on the Terminator, like fucking Cap and Bucky against Iron Man. And unfortunately, we didn't really get either of those things exactly. They throw hands for like a second or two before the kids stop them. But that whole scene is actually the Terminator using the voice decoy, the voice trickery that I don't think we've seen for a long time. That was really clever. And Reika picks up on the deception in a similar way that John Connor picked up on it in Terminator 2. So that was cool and interesting, but I was hoping we'd get that fight, and I was hoping we'd get more of a tag team, because we really don't. I mean, you would think that between the two of them, they could really put hands on this Terminator, and they really don't. They lose that fight real bad. They're never back to back. I mean, the Terminator manages to keep them separated and kind of incapacitate each of them individually. They never get a chance to throw hands on this guy like I wanted. And I guess that's because we need the Terminator in that final scene somewhere else. I get that. It was just a little disappointed. Maybe we'll get to see some cool, co-op Terminator beatdown in the next season or whatever happens next. But overall, I really enjoyed the show. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on it. thanks for listening. I hope everyone tunes in for whatever the next thing will be, the next random thing that I decide to talk about. Have a great day.